All right, everybody, time for another episode of the Red Delta Project podcast and live Q&A here on the Red Delta Project YouTube channel, where we take a fundamental approach to fitness to give you more control and freedom over your health and fitness habits. As always, I'm Matt Schifferly, founder of the Red Delta Project and author of the books that sponsor these episodes, like my new micro workouts book, Grind Style Calisthenics, Bodyweight Training for Martial Arts. Links to all of those titles to help support the show are down below in the description. So today's episode, we're talking about diet and exercise habits that put you in better alignment for your body type. And a lot of times these are known as like somatotypes. And if you're new to this, or if you're just coming to the idea of body types, there are three typical types with classical ways of thinking about this. You've got your endomorph, which is typically your bigger, larger, more muscular, yet more body fat laden individual. You have your ectomorph, which is kind of the other side of the scale. This is someone who's pretty lean and quote unquote lanky, if you will, little bit of fat, low muscle mass as well. And then you have mesomorph, which is kind of in the middle, but usually more of a muscular, fairly lean individual. Now, in all fairness, in many areas, experts don't really like this type of model because a lot of people don't fit very cleanly into a particular somatotype or body type standard. Because if you say, okay, this is what an ectomorph looks like, this is an endomorph, you're probably going to be hard pressed to fit most individuals in that narrow little box. Most people are somewhere in the amorphic mix of everything. It's kind of like you've got greyhounds and you've got bulldogs, but most dogs are neither of which. Like most of us are just generally mutts, not even purebreds, if you will. But on the other hand, we don't want to throw out this idea of dismissing body types overall, because we do have to recognize that there are different body types. Like people are just different. We don't all have the same structure. We don't all have the same type of build. And so applying diet and exercise advice without taking any of sort of a body type into consideration is kind of like saying any bulldog can look like a greyhound and vice versa, which of course is not true. You can make greyhounds more muscular and a little more body fat, but you can't turn them into bulldogs and vice versa. So that's one of the challenges we have with this, is the current way of thinking about somatotypes isn't practical and doesn't fit most people. But at the same time, we need to recognize there is a difference with different body types, and therefore different types of approaches may be warranted when it comes to diet and exercise. So what I've done over the years is I've kind of modified the model just a little bit, and that's what I often do here at Red Delta Project, where instead of using things in the conventional way, I change it just a little bit so all the pieces are still there, but there are a new way of looking at things so that we can use it in a more practical and effective way. So what I've done is, instead of thinking like we've got three different body types, we've basically just got a range, right? On one end of the scale, we've got our ectomorph, and on the other side, we've got the endomorph. And in the middle is kind of the mesomorph, and it's kind of like a bell curve. And the reason why this bell curve model kind of works a little bit better is it does leave room for understanding that there are different body types. However, when it comes to most of us, we don't fit either of these. Like any kind of regular bell curve, chances are really good you're average. You're in the middle. You're not an outlier to a large degree. So therefore, a lot of the advice that we often hear about do this for this body type and do this for that body type only works if you're an outlier, which most of us are not. But when we look at it as like on a spectrum, now we have room for everybody, and we can apply these habits along a scale of how much we would apply the habits for one side versus the other. And I even created a different kind of naming structure for it. So on the ectomorph side of things, this is what I call the burner side of the scale. Now, a burner is characterized by someone who has a sympathetic dominant nervous system, who is typically in a bit more of a catabolic state. So they're kind of going a mile a minute, go, 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 go. They can't stop. This is kind of fidgeting all over the time. Basically, individuals like my buddy in college who would drink caffeine to relax, high strung, if you will, right? That's a burner. Now, burners typically have no trouble or less trouble getting and staying lean. However, they have more of a challenge of building muscle. Okay? On the other side of the scale, you have the builder. And builder, that's the endomorph, right? The endomorph is more anabolic in nature, parasympathetic nervous system in their default way. The rest and chill is kind of more their default mode of operandi. They typically have more of a challenge losing body fat, but it's easier to build muscle and strength due to their more dominant anabolic nature. Okay, think of like linemen in NFL kind of ideas. So the question for you isn't whether or not you fit into a box of which type of body type you are, but rather where along that scale are you? Because when you recognize that you are probably somewhere in the middle, but you may lean a little bit more towards the burner or builder type of body type, now we can get real practical about how we can address diet and exercise to be more efficient and effective for what you need to be focusing on. Because a lot of the advice out there when it comes to eat this way and exercise this way and stuff doesn't take your type of physique into account. So you may very well be putting too much of your attention on advice that's more geared towards someone on one end of the scale when you may actually need to be doing more of the opposite. So this is a little bit of a self-reflection of where are you falling along this spectrum. So let me give you some things to look out for and how we can adjust them. So on the burner side of the scale, like I was saying, this is kind of more the hyperactive individual, right? Usually pretty lean, doesn't have too much trouble staying lean, right? But more of an issue on building strength and muscle. Like they can work out forever and build just a tiny little bit, and the second they stop working out, it seems to disappear like overnight, right? That's a burner type of body. And then on the builder side, it's like you just lift up, a jug of milk and you build muscle relatively easy. But it seems like it's like pulling teeth just to lose a little bit of body fat. So do you typically find yourself having more of an ease of one or the other? Is it easier for you to build or to burn? Now, for me personally, I lean a little bit more towards the burner side of the scale. I've always been go, 100 miles an hour, right? I've had lots of professionals in the health world and so on tell me that I have a sympathetic nervous system dominance. So I'm always pretty high strung, like going like crazy. So for me, building muscle is much more of a challenge, but it's relatively easy for me to stay a lot leaner. But on the other side, you've got guys like my buddy Tony, who was 250 pounds, like a brick wall, back when he was in the 8th grade. Like this guy had no trouble building a lot of muscle, but he always kind of carried a good amount of heft around with him at the same time, which made him perfect as a center for football when he played back in junior, even junior high, didn't even play in high school, right? That's a builder. So these are the characteristics and approaches that I've learned over the years work better for some individuals than others. So if you're a burner, all right, typically leaner but harder time putting on muscle, the quote hard gainer, right? This individual needs to put more attention into very strength-based activities to make sure that there is creating a stimulus for anabolic stimulus as much as possible. So strength training, very important. Keeping a focus also on adaptation and recovery. So you've got to sleep really well. And you've got to have a really solid diet. Like last week, I was talking about how when you're trying to build muscle, there's this myth of the caloric surplus, because the surplus by definition is consuming more than you actually need. However, this individual typically does better with consuming more in their diet. Not only is it more food that they typically can do well on, and they typically need to eat more than they think in order to build muscle, they're also a lot more well adapted to handle a higher carbohydrate load. Typically burners like myself, if the carbohydrate gets too low, it's actually counterproductive. They have a harder time building muscle, they have a harder time actually staying leaner, and they have a harder time having good energy for their workouts. So typically the low carb thing, the fasting thing, all of that stuff doesn't work so well for the burner in scale. Also, it's very important as a burner to recognize that while your body is typically well suited for very cardiovascular activity, burners are typically like runners, cyclists, cross-country skiers, that sort of thing. That's great, but it also can be more of a drain on your caloric expenditure. So you need to eat even more than you think you do. So typically the restrictive diets, the high cardio approaches and everything, not the most productive for burners, because you're naturally in a very high catabolic burn like crazy kind of state. You've got a metabolism of an atomic bomb. So you want to be a little bit more on the side of make sure you get plenty of food, make sure to have a decent amount of carbohydrates, and make the strength training, if building muscle and strength is a priority, one of the more cornerstones of your workouts as opposed to just a supplemental aspect of your workouts. And of course, this all depends on too of what are your goals, what are your resources, what are your preferences. Like if you're a burner and you're like, yeah, but I want to go and be a statewide cycling champion. It's like, okay, then definitely do that. Like, don't let these points of advice steer you away from the things that are actually going to go towards your goals. Now, builders, on the other hand, typically stronger, more muscular, more body fat. So this is the individual I find does very well, of course, with strength-based events. Typically the stuff moving the body through space, not quite as natural to them, right? They're more likely to be doing bench press rather than push-ups, or be on something that is stationary as opposed to moving through space. So for builders, rather, the way that we want to approach things is strength training is very good, but if you want to be a little more focused on your cardiovascular conditioning, because you lose that a hell of a lot faster. Plus, when it comes to diet, typically the lower carbohydrate areas of things and fasting stuff are better suited for builders in general. They take to the fasting stuff better. They take to the lower carb stuff a lot better. They get better results with that stuff. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that stuff. I'm just saying you may want to look a little bit less on the higher carbohydrate side of things if you say, you're starting to think to yourself, I'm a little bit more of a builder rather than a burner. And keep in mind too, it's not so much whether or not you fit one side or the other. It's just you lean a little bit more towards one side. Like if you lean a lot to one side, then you're probably gonna say, I need to really make sure my diet and exercise is much more like a burner. But if you're kind of in the middle and you lean ever so slightly, you don't need to go to that extreme. And that's the good thing about this kind of sliding scale, is you can adjust these habits up or down to the degree that actually fits you, as opposed to thinking it's all the way on or all the way off. I've got to have high carb or I've got to have low carb. No, take this stuff as a general guideline and then work on it over time and say, well, if I decrease my carbohydrate level a little bit, my energy level is better, I'm leaner, I perform better, that sort of thing. Okay, that's good. You don't need to go keto. You don't need to go to extremes, because typically extreme habits only benefit the outliers on the extreme end of the scale. And most of us are not on the outliers at the extreme. We're somewhere in the middle. So average habits are probably going to be best, but you may want to dial things a little bit left or right, one way or the other. So just quick recap, if you're a burner, don't worry too much about trying to stay lean. Carbohydrates may be more friendly than you think, and make sure that you're putting good emphasis on trying to be as anabolic as possible with good sleep, getting plenty of strength training in, and not shirking that type of strength type of exercise. And if you're a builder, then you're gonna have a harder time staying lean. So you wanna make sure that you are making the style of cardiovascular activity a little bit more of a important thing, of course, depending on your goals. You want to make sure that you are being mindful of your carbohydrate intake, because typically that can overload the system a lot quicker. And when it comes to building muscle, you probably don't need to be super high dialed in, like I got to have the perfect program and stuff, because you're probably going to have a lot easier time building muscle and strength almost with anything that you do, versus a burner is going to have to really get dialed in and know exactly what works best for them. So it's really kind of a question of where are you better off putting your attention? And that's why I'm making this episode, because everything in our fitness culture is like DEFCON 5, right? You go on the internet and everybody's like, this is the most important thing in the world. Like, you've got to eat this way and this type of diet and this type of thing. And everything is so damn important, when the reality is that probably about 90% out there is just overhyped stuff that you probably don't need to worry too much about. You need to be mindful of it, but it's probably a lot of stuff out there that you don't need to worry nearly as much about as a lot of people claim. And that's why I largely got into this realm of Red Delta Project and everything, because I used to do a lot of things back when I started fitness in my teenage years and even in my 20s, of making sacrifices, of having a super strict diet and making sure I did lots of cardio and lots of, things that everybody's like, it's so important, you got to do it this way. And then when I started to realize the fundamental principles of fitness that were actually in charge, I realized that the vast majority of stuff I was paying attention to wasn't really necessary at all. Like, no, I didn't need to count like fat grams with my food. I didn't need to track things. I didn't need to worry about getting more body fat on my frame. And a lot of times I would be doing tons of cardio. I was like, I gotta stay lean, gotta stay lean. And I probably could have just done a fraction of that and still stayed as lean as I am today. So it's really a matter of where are you better off putting your attention into having the most effect, and what things seem to come naturally, because the stuff that comes more natural to you, you don't need to work as hard on. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, that's easy for you. And some people are built. Well, yeah, use that to your advantage. If you naturally find that you're fairly lean, or you're naturally building muscle and strength a lot easier, then unless you want to take those things to the very limit, you don't need to put nearly as much attention and energy towards those things to maintain a good level of proficiency in those areas. And you can then shift those resources towards the things that are more challenging for you. So there you go. Diet and exercise, general guidelines for different body types. Are you a little more of a burner, a little more of a builder, or are you kind of somewhere in the middle? And that's the quote mesomorph that I still hadn't talked about, but that's kind of in the middle. You're kind of in the general area of you can do both. And then of course you're modifying your body fat and your muscle mass based on diet and exercise habits. So let's get to some questions here. We'll start right here at the bottom. Gavin, right on time here. Thank you very much for coming on in. Hey, Matt, recently appreciate RDP. You know how to cut out all the hype, because there's a lot of it out there. Absolutely. And back to basics. What would you recommend to build strength while not increasing muscle mass? Yes, very good question, because sometimes that does very well bode you, especially if you are an athlete who needs good power to weight ratio. Like for guys like me, when I was cycling, like we want to be really strong, but we don't want a lot of weight because that slows you down. So in order to do that, the best way to go about it is make sure you have a lot of tension in the muscle, because that's what's stimulating the degree in strength, but don't push your muscles to a super high level of fatigue. These days, a lot of the research is supporting the idea that pushing the muscles to very high levels of fatigue, where you're really grinding out the reps, is one of the key components of stimulating hypertrophy and muscle growth. But if you keep the muscle working hard, but you still stay well away from fatigue or failure, then there's less stimulus for building muscle, but there's still plenty of stimulus for building strength. So high tension, low fatigue. That's your recipe for building strength without much muscle mass. All right, questions coming in fast and furious. Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on in. Matt C. Hey, Matt, get Ben Patrick from ATG in the podcast. Thank you very much. I'll look him up. I always appreciate recommendations for this sort of thing. Very, very good. Had one here that fit, which I knew this was going to come up. I'm skinny fat. What kind of eating and training is right for me to put on muscle mass? This is the thing that kind of irks me a little bit these days, because maybe it's a pet peeve of mine, but I think this term skinny fat has gotten way too popular in the lexicon. It's like somebody put a label on something that's not something, right? I know people are like, of course skinny fat exists. The reality is that you have some body fat and low muscle mass. And while a burner may typically be on one side of the scale, where it's like I've got low body fat and low muscle mass, so I'm just skinny, but I'm not skinny fat. And then you've got a builder who's typically higher muscle mass, so they're not skinny fat, they're just muscular with some fat. So in the middle, skinny fat, what that is just simply you haven't built muscle and you haven't lost enough body fat. In which case, you're no different than almost 90% of everyone else out there. Like everybody is skinny fat except for the outliers. And the rhetoric out there of like skinny fat is a thing and stuff, it makes it seem like it's a very particular sort of condition or sort of circumstances that require special diet and special exercise and special supplements and all these sorts of things, because I swear it was just a term developed by marketers to just sell you crap you don't need. Because skinny fat is not anything special. It means you don't have enough muscle to be stretching out the skin and you have more body fat. So the recipe for that is exactly the same as everybody else. Get strength training, make sure that you're trying to build that muscle, so going towards the higher end of the hypertrophy spectrum, so you're really fatiguing the muscle when you're pushing yourself, and make sure you're eating really well. So you're getting a lot of whole foods, you're staying away from a lot of the junk foods and stuff that aren't really doing a whole lot for you, but are bringing a lot of calories in. Again, my usual recommendation when people are trying to lose body fat is nix the liquid calories. So don't drink anything that's got a calorie to it. I mean, a calorie maybe, sure, but nothing that has calories in it. If it's liquid and has calories, you don't drink it, full stop. And that's a general rule that I find works really well, because it's a hell of a lot easier to hack a ton of empty calories out of your diet if you just get rid of that stuff. Meanwhile, you're feeding your body with the best food you can. So really, the recommendation is the same as everybody. Strength training, build that muscle, eat really good food, and don't eat too much of the junk food. That's really all there is to it. Build the muscle, lose the fat, which is pretty much what everybody else is trying to do these days. Let's see what any questions I missed. Again, if you put a "Hey Matt" in the beginning, then I will be able to address your question pronto. Get a couple here that don't start off, but I know they're to me. Is it possible to gain muscle eating 2 meals a day with body weight? Well, you got two questions there. One, is it possible with body weight? Absolutely. But the method you use isn't that important, because the only thing that really is important is, are you progressively working your muscles? The actual method you're using isn't that important. So all you got to ask is, can this method progressively work my muscle? Meaning more tension and potentially more time. Of course, everything could be more time. So can the muscles work progressively harder over time? The answer, yes, of course. Okay, check mark on that. It's a viable method, right? 2 meals per day, absolutely. Because when you're talking about nutrition, the amount of meals that you eat per day is not really that important in the grand scheme of things. A lot of times when it comes to diet, we tend to think that things happen in 24-hour segments. Like there's this dietary or nutritional reset every day at the stroke of midnight or something like that. But what's most important when it comes to nutrition is, what is your average consumption over the course of a week, over a month, or even the better part of a year? Your ability to get a result won't depend on what you do in a 24-hour period. It's more about, what are you averaging over a longer period of time? So getting back to that, can you eat enough and good foods in 2 meals a day? Absolutely. Can you have progressive resistance and strength training with bodyweight training? Absolutely. So it certainly is possible, because when you look at it from the fundamentals of, can you satisfy the fundamentals that are required with 2 meals a day in bodyweight? Most definitely, for sure. Alan White, 89. Hey, Matt, do you think thumbless pull-ups are compromised versus hand grip? No, I don't think so. Especially when you consider, if you're on a bar, like a fixed bar, something that's not rotating, like handles on a suspension trainer, then your thumbs are not going to be doing a whole lot, either thumbed or thumbless, either way. So I don't think it's going to compromise your grip strength there. Although I do highly recommend that people have some degree of like a rotating handle with pulling at some point in their training. A suspension trainer, towel grips, or throwing a towel over that bar, just so that you can get a little bit of that grip in your thumb. The bulk of your gripping muscles are going to be in your fingers and even the folding of your palm. So as long as you've got that, that's most of your grip strength. And your thumb is almost kind of secondary. But if you can include it in at least some degree of exercise and pulling exercise throughout the week, you'll have that base covered very short. Felix Yap coming on. Push exercises. Why is that? And where and how should I slot in the push-up and grind style calisthenics to work towards the one arm push-up? Yeah, the reason for that is simple. Grind style, the original grind style program that I wrote in the book, was developed in such a way that I wanted to make that program as easy as possible to work the muscles as hard as possible. Low skill, high resistance, right? That's usually counter to what most of the calisthenics programs are out there. because a lot of the calisthenics methods that you find out there require at least some moderate degree of skill and proficiency, which isn't a bad thing. But in my experience, most people who do calisthenics, when they're trying to build muscle, are held back by their skills, by their neuromuscular proficiency and their control. So they only go so far in their calisthenics training, and then they hit a dead end because they're not improving how well they can use their muscles and their exercises. And they just stop because their ability to work the muscle harder is limited by that proficiency. So the original grind style calisthenics has much easier push-up variations on the straps. Then we go to dips, which are a push-up variant. Dips and push-ups are fundamentally pretty much the same thing. And then you can work the push chain muscles a lot easier that way with less degree of skill. Now, it doesn't mean that that stuff can't be applied to grind style calisthenics. You can apply any kind of exercise to it. So feel free to do that. But that's why I didn't have the normal push-ups and the typical progressions of push-ups that you see in typical progressive calisthenics format, is because I wanted to make it as low skill as possible to work the muscles as hard as possible, to just give people the fastest track to working their muscles and building muscle as efficiently and as effectively as possible, or as they can, sort of thing. Oliver DT. Hey Matt, thank you for your inspirational videos. Thank you for watching them. If you had to choose between doing hip dominant bridges and spine dominant bridges with shoulder flexion, which would you choose? Oh, very good, Oliver DT. Very good question. Actually, these days, I don't even choose. I do both. I do hip dominant bridges, and then I do spine dominant bridges on my extension chain days. I guess it really kind of boils down to what are you trying to accomplish? But in my experience, most people are better off doing hip extension dominant bridges. And the reason for that is because most of the folks that I coach, at least, have very poor tension control and strength and activation in their hips, their glutes and their hamstrings and stuff, and it's all going into their lower back and so on. And that's probably the area you're going to make the biggest improvement in your posture, your back issues, performance, and so on. So that's usually where I would steer people first. And then the spinal stuff would be more supplemental. I don't know of many people who have themselves being held back by poor spinal extension or poor spinal strength. But hip extension abilities and strength are usually a big hindrance that a lot of people fall into. So again, that's in the grind style calisthenic program. That's why I have hip focused or hip extension focused exercises and not spinal extension focused exercises. Because again, it's lower on the skill range, but the exercise I give you were much harder on the strength range. And plus you are getting spinal extension with hip extension focused bridges. It's just isometric. It's not getting that hyperextension, but you are getting that extension. And those muscles are working to a very large degree. Let's see what other questions we got coming on here. Yudi Betty. Hey Matt, based on what you're saying, it sounds like I lean towards a builder phenotype or somatotype. Very good. How much time do I give to diet before I know it's not helping and need to change things up? Well, it's always hard. There's two ways to answer this. My buddy and I, Al Painter, were talking about this on our new podcast today, the Fit at Home podcast, which is now available, shameless plug. And we were talking about how program hopping is a real big problem, both with diet and exercise. People give it a week or two and like, it's not doing anything. So on one hand, you definitely want to stick with a diet or a program long enough to give it an honest shot. But on the other hand, you don't necessarily just want to stay with something if you know it's not working for you. And that's why instead of thinking I'm on it or off it, think of modification, all right? Start with doing whatever the diet or the workout program is. But if you're starting to notice friction points, then address just those friction points, right? Change just those things. So if your diet calls for, let's say, eating 6 times a day, and that's one of those things, it's like, I do not like eating 6 times a day. I'm much better off eating like twice a day or something, or skipping breakfast kind of deal. If you know you may be better off with a tweak to the program, then just make the tweak. Like right off the bat, start making the tweak right away, but don't abandon the whole thing. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I would always say, give it a good solid couple of months. Oftentimes we think something's not working, because we haven't given it enough time to work. I covered this in a video earlier this week on the RDP YouTube channel. There's something called the plateau of latent potential. It's basically where you start making changes and things start happening, but you haven't reached a significant tipping point where you're noticing the results yet. So the example on this is always like putting a block of ice in a room that's increasing in temperature, and it goes from like 20 to 28 degrees. And you're saying, yeah, warming up the room isn't going to melt this ice. We're already gone from 20 to 28 degrees. It's not melting at all. It's a complete waste of time, not knowing that, of course, the ice isn't going to melt until you reach around 32 or 33 degrees. So when we're in that position where like, I'm not sure if this is working, you're very likely still in that plateau of latent potential. But if you're noticing friction points, change those things as effectively as you can, especially if you think to yourself, I'm having trouble with X, I think I may be better off with this other modification. You probably will be, and it's good to make that modification. Very good question. Fantastic. Let's see what other questions we got here. Ben, hey Matt, glad you changed the live stream hour. First time I can watch from France. Hey, very good. Where in France are you from? I've been to France twice. Little forest about an hour outside of Paris. I stayed with some friends when I was about 14 years old. Cassius Scipio, always good to see you, my friend. Hey Matt, if you wanted to practice plyometric, it says plyometric exercises within the ground style calisthenics, where would you program them in? Fantastic exercise. So the thing with plyometrics is you want to be relatively fresh for that. You don't want to be too terribly fatigued. So you would put them as a little bit of an additional phase in between the stability phase and the strength phase. So you go with tension phase, practicing engaging the muscle, stability phase, then you'd have your plyometrics, then strength, then finisher. That's where you would put them in because you want to have your muscles and everything ready to rock and roll, but you don't want to make your nervous system or your neuromuscular system really fatigued and tired from the other two phases. So put it as a fifth phase, very quick, in between the strength and the stability phase. Very good question. Fantastic. Dashin, hey Matt, I'm a builder in nature and want to lose fat. Will calorie hacking work? Calorie hacking is great. Calorie hacking is the act of just removing large amounts of calories from the diet or from the body through a good chunk of exercise. Absolutely, calorie hacking is fundamentally based, which means unless you're living in a different universe, you're playing by the same rules as everybody else. But keep in mind that it does require a skillful approach. There are lots of different ways you can do a calorie hack, of course, and having a way to fit it into your time and your schedule and what methods work best for you, because I list several of them in my book, Micro Workouts. Some are going to be better than others. Like for me personally, if I ever want to do a calorie hack, I've always much preferred a very good exercise bout. Like, okay, I'm going to go for a bike ride for 6 hours kind of thing. But I know for a lot of people, that's not practical and it's not a good way to go about it. I know a lot of people like fasting, right? That's not my bag. I don't do well at all with fasting, but I still include it in the book because I know it is a good, viable source for a lot of other people. Portion control is a big one as well. You know, cut everything in half for a few days, see what that works for you. But the key thing with calorie hacking, don't forget, is to always make sure you're getting back to a bit of a maintenance level. Don't compensate afterwards by overeating and put back the calories that you just hacked out. Just remember that. But sure, absolutely. Entrifis, hey Matt, is it possible to be successful personally or as a fitness trainer without adopting some sort of dogmatism? Absolutely. In fact, I would say that the best fitness professionals are not dogmatic about what they do, because as coaches and trainers and people who give advice, dogma is only going to hold you back. It's always a sign of someone who's drank a little too much of their Kool-Aid. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have your preferred methods, right? I'm a calisthenics guy. I like bodyweight training. I love giving people bodyweight training, right? But I'm not dogmatic about it at all. If someone comes to me and they're like, I hate doing calisthenics, it's like, all right, we're not doing calisthenics then. What do you like? I like dumbbells. dumbbells it is, right? Because the whole job of a health coach is to meet people where they are and to lead them in a direction they're willing to go. One of the biggest marks of a bad coach is someone who's dogmatic and says, well, this is the diet and workout program you have to follow. And when the client is struggling to fit with that dogma, they blame the client, right? They blame them for not being able to meet the coach where they are. Or if they're not willing to do it, they say, well, they're not serious enough and they're not willing to go to that degree and stuff. As coaches, it's our job to get to know who we're working with and saying, what do you have? What can you do? What are you willing to do? And then trying to get that to align as well as possible with their goal. Of course, there's some degree of that you can only bend a stretch of band so far, right? If someone came to me and said, I will have a dream of running a marathon, but I don't ever want to do any sort of running or cardiovascular activity. Yeah, I don't think that's going to really work too well. You're going to have to do that to some degree, right? But then we would dig into, okay, why don't you want to do that sort of thing? What's holding you back with that? Let's explore what are your hangups so we can get you around that. But the worst coaches out there are very dogmatic in nature. We have our methods that we prefer. We have the things that are our go-to. But if someone's not willing to go to that or doesn't want to use it, we've got a million and other directions that we can go to. So not being dogmatic is definitely the key to being a successful coach. Kimberly back in the house. Good to see you, Kimberly. Hey, Matt, what are your thoughts on reverse dieting? What's the best way to go from diet to muscle building without gaining back the fat lost? Very good question. See, a lot of times this quote reverse dieting is usually, I think, what people are just interpreting as they're no longer restricting themselves. Remember, a healthy diet is about satisfying your appetites. It's about giving your body what it needs and what it can use. So a lot of times this idea of reverse dieting is followed by people who have gone through a very restrictive period. Things like bodybuilders and figure competitors and stuff who have had a very restrictive diet for a good amount of time to be as lean as possible for a contest or a show. So then when they go back to it, they're, quote, reverse dieting, which isn't actually reverse dieting. It's just eating normally again. They're now feeding their body as it should be. And when we take the approach that a healthy diet is about satisfying your appetites, instead of being based on a restriction, which is most of all dietary advice out there is based on restriction, then now you're actually just eating healthy. Reverse dieting is just healthy eating. It's no longer having a restrictive approach, but a satisfying and healthy approach to food, which in my opinion is what a healthy diet is all about. So I guess you could say I'm all for it because that's how a healthy diet is supposed to be going along with that. Rita. Hey, Matt. This is Hey Math. Apparently I'm not the only one saying Matt and math back and forth today. My height is 177 centimeters and weighing 90 kilograms. I already trained last year and got to 79 kilograms, but left last summer. Wanted to ask if I should add cardio on every day of my workouts. Well, whenever we're asking if we should add something to our workouts, we should always consider if it's a practical thing to add. Lots of times we consider like, should I add this or should I do this in addition? Anytime we're doing an additional thing that's going to take effort, we should, one, ask ourselves if we can easily maintain that habit. We have the resources, the time and the energy and motivation. Two is it going to help us further satisfy the fundamental principles of what our goals are? So with cardiovascular activity, what you're doing is you're training your body to be good at cardiovascular activity. So that's something to consider if that you want to be good at cardio. It will burn more calories, but you can burn more calories doing anything. So it doesn't need to be cardio. It can be anything that you want. So if your objective is to burn more calories, literally do anything that you can fit into your lifestyle. That's a good fit because I know sometimes people say, I need to burn calories. I need to do cardio. You can do anything. Take up an active hobby, go for long walks. Some people I know have lost weight because they start working part-time as a dog walking service. And they walk dogs, it's not cardio, so to speak, but it's still burning calories. So in those two things, you want to consider, like, is this going to be worth the cost and the effort? And lastly, whenever you do add something in, don't be afraid to change things around. So if you add something in and after a couple of weeks, you're like, it's hard to maintain, it's not really working for me, make changes, be flexible in your approach. But as always, you're going to learn your most from your experience. So you got to give things a try. And that's how you're going to really learn if something's going to work for you, as opposed to just going down infinite number of internet rabbit holes asking, should I do this or should I not do that? You're going to learn a lot more in 5 minutes or 5 days of trying something out than you will in 5 minutes of just going all around with on the internet and all those back and forths and everything. Fantastic, Everett. Good questions today. Man, you guys are bringing it on. Let's see if I missed anything here. I apologize if I don't address anything directly here. Warning shot 37. I get the pain almost like, oops, sorry. I know I missed one more thing here. One more thing. So anyway, what other questions can I answer for you folks? Even things outside the box. Any challenges that you're having? Is there any sort of thing that seems to be kind of coming up time and time again where you are running into the same obstacles? Hit me up with those. Tyler League has a good point. It sounds like slow twitch versus fast twitch dominant. That for the body types, absolutely, for sure. Although it is curious, the muscle fiber dominant theory doesn't hold nearly as much water in the research as we think it does. Like on the ends, you may have an individual who is one or the other, but it's amazing how many powerlifters are actually slow twitch dominant individuals and how many marathoners are fast twitch dominant individuals. And for the most part, unless you've got the genetic freaks out there, most people are pretty 50-50 back and forth. And usually I find when people start basing things off of like, I'm fast twitch dominant, I'm slow twitch, I'm making my exercises this way because of fast twitch and slow twitch, the research just doesn't really support that it's a practical way to go about it. That it's very hard to create exercises that focus on one type of muscle fiber. And even if you could, whether or not it would be effective at getting a given result is really up in the air. So usually the whole idea of different muscle fiber types is something that the jury's still out as far as, could you be more dominant in one way? Is a muscle more dominant in individual muscles per chance? But it's not something I usually recommend people start structuring their workout programs around, just because it's a bit of shot in the dark type of approaches when it comes to what the research has been showing. Hamza, good question here. Hey, Matt, thank you for your tips, man. You're the best. Thank you very much. What do you think of lean bulking? Is the optimal approach for building muscle while staying quite lean? So lean bulking, as I understand it, is you're eating a lot, but you're eating relatively like clean. It's the opposite of like a dreamer bulk, as they would call it. Dreamer bulk, where you just gorging and pigging yourself out like crazy. They call it a dreamer bulk because you put on a ton of weight, but if you think even a significant amount of that is muscle, you're dreaming because you're basically just pigging out on junk food all the time. But yeah, I mean, when we were talking last week about calorie surplus and stuff, when it comes to should I eat more to build muscle, my recommendation is, yeah, by all means, if you think you can build more through eating more, go for it. Because when you eat more and you build more, that's still not a surplus. That's called eating enough to fill your body's calorie demands. Your body can use calories, but you've been restrictive in your diet. So you're no longer restrictive and you're now actually eating to satisfy your needs. So with a quote lean bulk, you're typically just saying, I'm going to eat more, but it's just good food. And that's usually what I recommend is, yes, if you're going to eat more, you want to give yourself the best chance that your body's going to use the food you're eating, right? If I eat a bunch of Twizzlers and Ben & Jerry's ice cream, what are the chances that I'm going to use that for productive recovery and stuff? The more nutrient dense your foods are, the more you're physically feeding yourself with, the greater the chance that you're going to use it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do that sort of thing, but yes, if you want to entertain eating more, try to get foods that are nutrient dense, which is typically, quote, clean, which is why people call it a lean bulk, because it's harder to enter a calorie surplus when you're eating more lower calorie nutrient dense foods because you're probably not going to overdo it quite as much as if you were just eating nothing but fast food all of the time. So it's usually the recommendation I have. And 9 times out of 10, if someone's like, I don't know if I should eat more, I say, yeah, great, eat more. But a lot of times people are better off eating more of what they're already eating. Like if you eat 2 eggs in the morning, have 4. If you have, a 6-inch sandwich for lunch, have a foot long, or a foot long and a 6-inch kind of thing. So that way you're adding exactly what you are already eating, which is probably what you're going to have the best approach with. Kimberly, another question here. Hey, Matt, what are your thoughts on heart rate training? Does it increase your cardio abilities? Very good question. Yeah, heart rate training is something I've got a lot of experience with, usually fairly hit or miss, because there's a lot of, it's kind of like the fiber type thing from what I was talking about. A lot of the science is very murky. It's kind of hit or miss. A lot of times just being able to know what your zones should be can be very hard. The story that I was told was the whole 220 minus your age thing is basically about that close to pseudoscience, and it's not nearly as scientifically valid as we think it is. So if we base things off just that formula, then we're basing it off of an assumption and so on. And I know a lot of people, myself included, where it doesn't even come close. Like I know some people who will be out on a bike ride with me and they're at like 89 or 85, 90% of their heart rate zone. And they're talking to me like I'm talking to you now. It's like, how is your heart rate that high? And it's like you're just cruising. Me, on the other hand, usually my heart rate is relatively low. So I'll get to 170 as a beats per minute. And, or at least back in college when I was doing a lot of heart rate training, people were like, you should be fairly comfortable at this. And I'm just dying, right? With that said, I do think it's a very useful tool, especially for things like heart rate based intervals. I do this a lot with clients sometimes, especially if they're kind of feeling a little out of it. And I'll say, okay, you're going to do a sprint until you get to a certain heart rate threshold, a high threshold, and then you come back down and you do the sprint again once it gets low enough. And that way it's adaptive to your current level of fitness. So it's a fun tool, bottom line. I think it's fun to explore, but I wouldn't be dogmatic about it. And you certainly don't need to do it in order to improve your cardio. Like it's not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Like I used to race with a heart rate monitor. The heart rate monitor would be like flashing and going off on alarms going, your heart rate's really high. And it's like, no kidding, it's a bike race. That's what happens during a bike race. So like all sorts of trackers, use it to collect data you can use. If you're not using the data you're collecting, it's just a form of entertainment and it's just kind of, hey, that's kind of neat to know, but you're not actually getting any benefits out of it. Rafa asking, hey, Matt, appreciate advice and progress in pull-ups effectively when overweight, but getting diet and workouts more consistent. Fantastic. So like all calisthenics, we can progress and regress things to whatever you're bringing to the table, right? There's no difference between bodyweight training and regular weight training. We can go from ridiculously easy to insanely difficult and everywhere in between. But we get caught in this calisthenics rut of thinking that we do pull-ups or push-ups or squats one particular way. That's like saying if you're going to do a bench press, 135. That's the weight you should always be using, right? It's just a mental thing. So get out of the rut of thinking that pull-ups are done a certain way, usually military style, right? And explore other pull-up variants that may be a lot easier. Things like your feet are on the ground, or like I'll take gymnastics rings or suspension straps or something about chest height, and that way the feet are somewhat assisting. Or you can do it if you're at a gym with some sort of assistance, those assistance machines that help lift you up. So you're essentially subtracting your body weight. So it's the opposite of using like a dip belt. Instead of weighing more, you weigh less. Bands also work very well as a cheap alternative. You can also just experiment with hand and grip positions. So usually coming in closer together will make it a little bit more challenging as well. So if you're doing pull-ups with your feet on the ground, your legs are straight out in front of you, pulling up like so is a good way to go about it. But again, that's why I created the Grind Style Calisthenics program, which is down below in the description, because it's got progressions of pulling exercises that almost anybody can do. And there's a level that will match anybody's fitness level. And then you just adjust that like you would adjust the weight pin on a weight machine and just see what works best for you. Very good. Very good question. One more. I missed one. Yeah, we're still on this one, Andy. You only need a few hundred calories to build, few hundred calories in surplus to build muscle. It's a couple of mouthfuls of food extra day, pointless getting fat than dieting. I agree. I mean, yeah, I know technically, like, no, you don't even need a surplus because a surplus by definition is something you don't need. But no, Andy's spot on. There was some research done years ago. I wish I could link to it, but God, it was like 20 years ago. And they were like, well, how much extra food does somebody actually need? And they determined it was the extra calorie and protein equivalent of one hot dog. Like I was saying earlier, like an egg, an egg's worth or 2 eggs worth at breakfast. And that would be all that you really need. You probably don't need nearly as much as you think you do. Entirely Honest asks, hey, Matt, do you practice meditation and or yoga? Yoga and I are like oil and water, man. I don't know what it is. I've done several yoga classes throughout the years. I keep trying it, and I always feel horrible when I'm doing it. And afterwards, I'm like, that was the worst experience ever. I don't know if it's probably just something I need to stick with or whatever, but it's usually something I like, no, I'll do anything other than yoga. My body does not like to take to it very well. But meditation is anything that I do with more of a moving meditation. This is a tip that I learned from Expressing the Human Body, book on Bruce Lee's exercise program. And he always talked about how he had his most meditative times when he was jogging around Hong Kong in the morning. And I always found that to be the case for myself. Whenever I was hiking, riding my bike, backcountry skiing, my mind and everything just kind of would empty out, and I would feel a lot better mentally and get everything to process if I was just doing something outside. It was always outside. Never worked if it was cardio inside, but always outside, something fairly repetitive. I didn't have to work too much mentally to do it, but that always was the best meditation for me. So I guess that's meditation, but not really the whole sit and breathe and kind of thing. I do that a lot when I'm typing, I guess you could say. I know I missed a couple here. Try and get everybody. Yeah, I think I got that there. Very good. Peter, fantastic. Thank you for coming on. I am new to your channel. I have been following isometric training the last few days. How would you describe the difference in feeling muscles after a couple of weeks of isometric training? Mostly what I would say is fuller. I noticed that after doing isometric training for the first few weeks, my muscles just felt like they were more full after my workouts. And I got a lot more comments on my videos and stuff. People were saying, you look fuller, you look a little more defined, stronger, bigger and stuff. That was the result of my isometric training, for me at least. That's what I experienced for sure. Lightning, again here, the fitness industry recommends a minimum of 0.8 grams kilogram per day of pound of body weight to build muscle. Do you believe in this? It's so hard to say. One thing that I think we kind of keep getting our wires crossed on is these protein recommendations. I think people skim them too quickly and we get kilogram and pound mixed up. So a lot of times a study will say like 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, and someone else will say 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. But when they're referring to the study or where they're thinking, well, the science shows so much per pound. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we keep coming across when it comes to protein recommendations is we keep getting pound and kilogram mixed up. So we're actually high or low, even though we think we're spot on because we can't remember, or the person who's giving us the advice got their wires crossed. So anyway, there's that to consider. The thing is though, I mean, I usually don't go by numbers when it comes to diet too much, because knowing the exact grams of any sort of intake is a very hard undertaking to do. Like nutrition labels are wrong a lot of the time. Calorie labels are wrong a lot of the time. Our actual requirements are off a lot of the time. And even if one of these things is off by 5%, when you compound all of these different things that can be off, by the end of it, it's like the telephone game. By the end of it, you're, selling dishwashers on a submarine to Mary who's living on Mars. It doesn't make much sense. So that's why I always tell people, step one is get consistent with your protein intake. So consistent diet, consistent protein intake, just some protein each meal and so on. Then add more in, see if you get a benefit, right? That way you don't have to count anything, you don't have to measure anything, you don't have to be reading labels, just have consistent protein intake. And if you think you're better off with more, eat more, and you know it's more because of what's consistent. So if you usually have 2 eggs in the morning, now having 4, you know it's more. What's the number? Doesn't really matter, it's more. And if more is beneficial, you'll know it as well. So thank you very much. Good point. And don't worry too much about like so-and-so says this much and so-and-so says that much. It's stuff that you're just going to get lost in. It's not going to really benefit you very much. Entrifice, and I hope I'm pronouncing that one, Entrifice. Hey, Matt, is there anything that you personally do or would recommend focusing on in regards to improving erectile health, cardio, nutrition? Promise I'm not trolling. It is a good question because that is a bit of a canary in the coal mine, as I understand it. Is erectile health is functioning very much in the similar way of a lot of other cardiovascular health aspects of the rest of our body. It is blood flow. It is blood flow. It is ready blood flow. It's things regulated by things like blood pressure and stress and a whole host of other factors, not to mention also stress and other things going on between the ears or even emotionally. So I think it is very good, but a lot of times, like a lot of other things in fitness, it's not so much about doing anything specific for those issues. It is about general health and well-being, general physical health, mental health, emotional health. Whatever improves your health generally is probably going to have a lot of carryover to that erectile style health as well. So cardiovascular, anything that gets a heart rate up as well, strength training, isometrics are typically very good for improving things like blood pressure and stuff because of that vasodilation and constriction that goes on with isometric training and stuff. And as always too, consult your doctor. Like I'm not at all qualified to be assessing any sort of thing of that nature. So if you think there's something specific or a condition that may be going on, definitely see a health professional about it. But generally, healthier diet, healthier eating habits, pushing your body to a good level of intensity will probably have good carryover to it as well. Very good, very good. And that's one of those things that when we're looking at specific things, look to general health and fitness practices and habits, the things you should be doing but aren't quite doing. Those are typically the things that we need to do. A lot of times we go to the doctor to be told to do the things we already know we should be doing as well. Let's see, a couple more real quick to wrap things on up. Cameron, I'm 16 and trying to lose belly fat and trying to build muscle. What's the best way? The same way as everybody else. Get your diet down and dialed in and make sure that you are doing regular, consistent strength training. But keep in mind too, that at that age, like you're dealing with a whole host of potential hormonal and developmental things going on in the body. It's crazy how different people are at that stage in life. When I was 16, like there were kids who looked literally like kids, like little boys and girls. And at the same time, it's like, I'm 17 years old. And you're like, dude, you look like you're 40. Like you have a receding hairline and you look like you've already graduated college. There's so much development going on at different stages and different rates of speed at that age and stuff. So usually it's very hard to have any reliable and consistent development in the body for across a number of people. Like there are so many people I know when I was growing up in high school and they worked out like fiends and they got their diet dialed in and nothing happened whatsoever. And then they turned 21, bang, and everything changed overnight. So don't be too frustrated. I wish I knew that when I was back in 16, 17, 18 years old of just establishing your good habits right now. That's your number one objective. Get your diet down and focused on being satisfied eating whole foods. Get your workout habits dialed in. So you're doing basic strength training. You're getting a little bit of conditioning in there. Maybe play some sports and stuff if you can in your school or extracurricular activities. You're just trying to do something at this stage in life. Don't worry too much about is it working or not, because building up the habits will ensure things will be working for sure. Dijar Nushi, how would one know that if low or high volume is working best for building muscle? Because you're probably going to be better off with both. The research these days is, again, pointing to that as long as you're getting that fatigue going on in the muscle and you're really pushing it to a high level of exhaustion, that's probably what's the main stimulus from exercise that's going to drive muscle growth. But probably the worst thing we can do is stick with one type of strength training program. It's like, I do high volume, I do low volume. Okay, you low volume guys do high volume, you high volume guys do low volume. Switch it up, and you're probably gonna do better off doing each. Because when we do that, we stimulate a lot more than just muscle. It's also nervous system. It's our mind. It keeps the workouts feeling fresh. So I would say, don't worry about what's the best way to do strength training or how should I best do this. Keep it varied, because one of the great things about understanding that fatigue level is one of the primary drivers of creating hypertrophy is that it gets us out of that idea of I have to do it a certain specific dogmatic way. You can strength train 20 ways from Sunday, and it can all work as long as you have that factor to at least some degree. One more here, Mariano. Hey, Matt, I was testing as a finisher to do 1 or 2 series with the rest pause system. I feel very good at work. What do you think? Fantastic. Yeah, rest pause. Man, rest pause is just one of those things that's so simple. You get down and you're doing a set to the point where you just can't do more reps. You stop literally for like a few seconds, and then you go again and you eke out a couple more. For a lot of people, pushing their muscles hard enough into that fatigue zone is very hard, especially as a beginner, because 9 times out of 10, what we think is failure is probably a couple of reps short of what we can actually do. So that rest pause strategy can help push us a little bit further than we think we can. Plus, it can be a lot more time efficient as well. So if you think of, I do a set, I push to a high level of fatigue, then I rest for 5 minutes or whatever, then I do a whole nother set just to get to that fatigue point. You're just constantly hitting that fatigue point over and over and over and over with the rest pause training. I think you can accomplish a lot more in a lot less time and save a lot of wear and tear on your joints as well, because the volume is so much lower. So fantastic, outstanding. One more here, because I gotta do macros matter. Absolutely. But I know a lot of people, they try to over engineer these things. Like, okay, I'm at like 21% protein and 36.2% fat and 29. No, it doesn't need to be that precise and stuff. When it comes to macro stuff, here's what I recommend is, if you're edging towards one side, like higher fat or higher carb or higher protein and stuff like that, the change in the difference should be big enough that you should notice it without counting numbers. So if you say to me, I'm going much lower carbohydrate, you should be able to just look at your plate and say, that's lower carbohydrate than before, or that's more of a fat-based and protein-based food than before. And yeah, it's a little bit different. As I was saying about the somatotypes before, typically burners do better off with a higher carbohydrate concentration in their diet. Builders typically go with lower carbohydrate concentrations in the diet and higher of fat, and then protein's pretty much the equalizer between the two. So it does matter, but it's not like changing your macros is the be all end all to a healthy diet or weight loss. It's more of just dialing in what type of foods and how you feel best about the diet that you're following to perform at your best. Oh, what the hell? Questions are coming in fast and furious now. JG, can you build muscle with resistance bands? I only have 4-pound dumbbells at home. Gyms are closed, and I am female. Okay, very good. Yeah, you can build muscle with anything that makes the muscle work hard. That's the only rule we have to follow, is make your muscles work progressively harder over time. I don't care what program you're using. I don't care what your routine looks like. I don't care what tools you're using, because ultimately your muscles don't know any of that stuff. All they know is, how hard do you need me to work? Okay, harder than last time? Okay, great. And there you go for your stimulus. I will say though, I'm not the hugest fan of resistance bands, just because I don't like the change in resistance as you stretch them out. They have more resistance as you stretch and less resistance as they return to their resting length. I much prefer more consistent resistance, like moving a unit of mass against gravity, be it your body or a weight or something like that. My boss, who is coaching at the gym, always had this to say. He's like, weights make you stronger, bands make you smarter. And that's how we would always program bands, is to help people learn things like scapular movement, tension control, stability, range of motion. Like anytime he's like, I want you to be able to do this better, he would turn to bands. And anytime he's like, well, let's get you stronger, he would turn to weights. But no, that doesn't mean that you can't do it with bands. As long as you're progressively working, you can be successful. I just don't think it's the most efficient way to go about it, in my opinion. And yes, I have a lot of extensive experience working with bands. That was actually all I did for about 3 years when I started fitness, is all I used were bands. Justin Nugent, how much weight loss in a week is healthy? Oh, as much as you want. Really, it's really hard to say because, I mean, hell, I've lost 10 pounds in an afternoon. I mean, it's water, from riding my bike 100 miles in 90-degree heat out here in Denver, Colorado. But, weight loss, healthy and so forth, it depends on what it is. It depends on how big you are too. The bigger you are, the more you're going to lose very quickly and stuff like that. Don't worry too much about the number that you're losing. Just pay attention to things like, how does your energy level fare and how does your performance in your workouts? If you still feel good, you're sleeping good and your performance is good and everything like that, rock on, keep on going. Don't worry too much about it. John, just for the public service announcement here. Hey, Matt, what time and days do you usually live stream? So right now it's a Wednesday deal and I'm doing it at 3 p.m. I'm looking at potentially maybe moving to a Thursday, Friday time. Not quite sure. I'm still trying to figure out when is best for everybody. But right now, Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time is when I do this. All right, everybody. I am getting hoarse. I didn't bring my water, unfortunately, while I was doing this, so I've been talking for over an hour. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming on, being a part of the RDP community here. As always, you can listen to these playbacks on the RDP podcast through your preferred podcast distribution. So if you missed this, you can always just listen to it through your podcast directory. And of course, it's available to watch on the RDP YouTube channel as well. So thank you so much, everyone. I will see you next week. Till then, be fit and live free.